日本デザイン会議91年島根第1番目のプログラムを開始させていただきたいと思います。第1番目はイギリスからお迎えしましたコリン・ウィルソンさんによります真相のメディア生と死を結ぶものという特別講演でございます。コリン・ウィルソンさんは1931年にイギリスでお生まれになり、ずっとコーンウォールにお過ごしです。このウィルソンさんのご本は、実は日本の文化に大変大きな影響を与えています。アウトサイダーというウィルソンさんが25歳の時にお書きになった本は、1957年に日本ですでに翻訳されていますが、その後10年間、あるいはもっとそれ以上、今日までずっと読み継がれている大ベストセラーかつロングセラーです。特に、私と大体同じ世代の人たち、30代から40代の人たちにとって、神様とも言うべき方、教祖とも言うべき方です。60年代の日本のサブカルチャーの最初の形を作るきっかけになった人です。ウィルソンさんのお書きになった「アウトサイダー」という本は、歴史上のさまざまな人たちのアウトサイダーとしての生き方を、紹介してくれた本です。で、そのようなものを読みながら、私たちの世代は新しい生き方を模索していたというふうに言うことができるかと思います。またその後でもオカルトであるとか賢者の石であるとか、このようなオカルトという用語は私たちの文化の中で定着しておりますけれども、ちょっとそのイメージは違います。むしろ人間の近代の人間観では見えないような人間のもっと力強い側面、別の可能性を見せてくれた、非常に膨大な、歴史の本です。あるいは、人間の凶暴さ、異常さにも目を背けずに、そういうものも人間の闇のような部分も見つめてこられた方です。私が知っているだけで23冊の翻訳が出ています。今でも日本で非常にたくさんの熱狂的なファンをお持ちの作家でいらっしゃいます。今度はこの第1番目の特別講演にコリン・ウィルソンさんをお迎えすることができて、私たち大変光栄に思っております。ではウィルソンさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
I want to talk to you today about an aspect of media that may be unfamiliar. This conference is about surviving media, which implies that media is some kind of an enemy. When we think about media, we think about newspapers, television, the lights that flash on and off in big cities, advertising products. And we think of these things as overwhelming us with too much information. Now, I'm not very interested in that aspect of media. Do you remember the book by Marshall McLuhan that became so popular in the 1960s called Understanding Media? And what McLuhan said in that book is that media are the extensions of man. The wheel is an extension of the human leg. It enables us to travel about more easily. The telescope is an extension of the human eye. It enables us to see further into space. All media are an attempt to escape from the narrowness of our human condition. Human beings are naturally trapped in the present moment. We are trapped by the walls around us at this moment. We can see no further than these walls. Our hearing is limited in the same way. In a certain sense, you could say that human beings are stuck in the present moment like flies stuck on sticky flypaper. Ever since the beginning of civilization, all philosophers have been pessimistic. Aristotle once said, "It is better not to have been born." As soon as men begin to think, they recognize the limitations of the human condition, and they become pessimistic. Media are an attempt to extend these limitations and to see further into the distance. So, our basic purpose is to try to see beyond our narrow little limitations. This is the thing about media that fascinates me so much. And the first medium which man developed was language. Language enables us to conjure up images of objects which are not actually present here at this moment, and to manipulate and control these images. And so, without even understanding what he is doing, man has always striven to become something bigger than himself. You could say that man's basic striving is to become a god. And although we would all feel that this is a kind of conceit, if you think about it carefully, you will see nevertheless that it is true. The fundamental aim of human beings is to escape the limitations of their human condition. And this has been the subject of all my work. Now, if I may, I will try to describe to you the basic idea behind all my work. My first book was called The Outsider, and it was published in England in 1956. The subject of The Outsider was the fact that so many men of genius in the 19th century committed suicide, or died of tuberculosis, or died in stupid accidents. And this for me was very puzzling. I wanted to know, why did so many of these men of genius die so stupidly? Because in the 19th century, for the first time in human history, men suddenly began to glimpse vistas, horizons, far beyond their ordinary human limitations. Do you know that picture by Van Gogh called The Starry Night? A picture which shows all of the sky turning into immense whirlpools of vitality, and the trees look as if they're flames shooting up towards the heavens. When Van Gogh painted that picture, with candles tied around his hat so that he could see the canvas, he was obviously in a state of ecstatic intensity, with the feeling that all life is good. And yet, only 2 years later, Van Gogh committed suicide by shooting himself in the stomach, and left a suicide note which said, "Misery will never end." Which was true? The Starry Night or the suicide note? Is it true that human beings are ultimately all doomed to defeat? The 19th century did not believe this. They believed that man can somehow be much greater than he is. And again, the great poets of the 19th century in Europe experienced peculiar moods of ecstasy, of sheer overwhelming happiness, like Van Gogh's Starry Night, in which they felt that all life is wonderful and that no one could ever want to die. And yet again and again, they committed suicide. This, for me, was the great paradox, the great riddle. And this brings me to one of my most interesting recognitions. The modern world has been created by a new kind of medium, a medium which came into being in Europe in the year 1740. In 1740, a London printer called Samuel Richardson decided that he would write a volume teaching people how to write letters. And he began writing letters that were supposed to be from young men to their fathers, from young ladies to their mothers, from suitors to the girl they were in love with, and so on. Then he remembered a story that someone had once told him about a servant girl called Pamela. Pamela's mistress had died, and the young master of the house said to Pamela, "Don't worry, Pamela, you can be my servant and look after me." And at the beginning of Richardson's novel, Pamela, she is writing a letter to her mother saying, "Isn't it wonderful? I expected to lose my job, and instead, the young master has made me his own personal servant." And then she continues in the postscript, "I feel rather worried. He just came into the room and placed his hand on my shoulder in a very significant manner." And of course, for the remainder of the novel, the young master tries to rape Pamela. He leaps out of cupboards on her when she's in bedrooms and chases her around the garden and so on. But being an extremely virtuous girl, Pamela refuses to go to bed with him. And at the end of the novel, the young master decides to marry her. Now, this book fascinated the whole of Europe. No one had ever read anything like it before. You see, novels did not exist before this in Europe. You had them here in Japan 1,000 years ago with things like The Tale of Genji. But in Europe, the novel of that period was a kind of travel book, like Robinson Crusoe. No one ever thought of telling stories about individuals like you and me, about ordinary people. You might say that Samuel Richardson invented the soap opera. And what this meant was that readers could begin to read this book, Pamela, and become totally absorbed in it. They could travel away into a world of imagination. It was almost as if someone had invented the magic carpet of the Arabian Nights, and you could float away into another world. You see, you cannot imagine how boring it would have been to live in England in the year 1700. Nothing ever happened. The most exciting event of the week was when people went to church on Sunday and listened to the sermon. And the result was that volumes of Sunday sermons became bestsellers. And then along came Richardson and produced this extraordinary farrago of imagination. And suddenly, everybody began to write novels and everybody began to read novels. Within a year, Pamela had been translated into every European language, and suddenly everyone was writing the novel. In other words, Samuel Richardson taught human beings to take mental voyages, voyages in the imagination, and in so doing, he created a completely new medium. The invention of the novel was as important for humankind as the invention of the wheel. It was a new dimension of being. It meant quite suddenly that people could escape their limitations. For example, in Yorkshire, in the north of England, in a small vicarage in the middle of a bleak moor, lived a vicar named Bronte and his 4 daughters and their son. They had nothing to do in this bleak place, and so the daughters began writing novels. Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights, Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, Anne Bronte wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. They created their own world of imagination. Of course, all of these novels had the same subject. They were all about attractive young ladies and handsome men. They were, in short, daydreams. But the Brontes succeeded in projecting their frustrations into a world which everybody could enter. It was a new way for human beings to share their experience. And in that sense, it was a completely new medium. That began in the year 1740 with Pamela. And 60 years later, by the beginning of the 19th century, suddenly the poets were experiencing these strange ecstasies. The English poet William Wordsworth describes in his poem The Prelude how one night he walked down to the edge of Lake Windermere and found a small boat and rowed out into the middle of the lake until he could see the shapes of the mountains all around him. And he said he experienced a strange sense that these mountains were all alive, living beings. And he talked about experiencing the feeling of unknown modes of being. In other words, quite suddenly, ordinary men were turning into religious mystics. In the past, only a few great men had been mystics, and they, in Europe, were all members of the Christian church. In the East, in Asia, they belonged to many religions: Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, Confucianism. Now suddenly, in the 19th century, dozens of men who were in no sense religious began to experience these same strange ecstasies, the feeling that the universe is a far bigger place than any of us realize. And yet, the ecstasies also produce the opposite, moods of intense, miserable depression and misery. People like Van Gogh experienced the feeling of ecstasy when they happened to be in moods of high intensity. And then, the next morning, when they woke up, they couldn't imagine what they meant by it. Everything had disappeared. It was as if some wicked magician had simply made the world vanish, and they found themselves bored, tired, trapped in the present moment. I want to talk to you about one of the most interesting mystics of the 20th century, because this explains why I am so interested in the subject of ecstasy. His name was Ouspensky. He was a Russian, and he was a disciple of George Gurdjieff, who was probably the greatest single thinker of the 20th century, in my own opinion. At some point in his life, Ouspensky decided that he would try to create mystical states. He doesn't explain in his book, A New Model of the Universe, how he did this, but I am pretty sure that he did it very simply by using ordinary dental anesthetic. You know, the gas they give you, or used to give you, when you went to the dentist to knock you unconscious. The American philosopher William James also used it and found that it created, in small doses, these same curious states of mystical insight. Now, Ouspensky says that as soon as these mystical experiences began, the first thing he realized is that we can say nothing about them. Not because language is inadequate, but because in order to say anything, you would need to say everything. Because everything is connected together. Everything in the universe is connected together. So there is no point at which you could start speaking. Imagine that you are a small child and you have been taken for the first time in an aeroplane, and that you are speaking with your family over the telephone, and they say, "Describe what you see." And you would say, "It's impossible. I'm seeing too much." This is the problem with mystics. Ouspensky also said that in these states of great intensity, time changed completely. Time appeared to go very, very slowly. He said that he began a sentence with the words, "I said yesterday," and he said when he used the word "I," quite suddenly he thought of hundreds of ideas about the mystery of identity, about the meaning of the ego, and so on. When he said the word "said," he thought of hundreds of ideas about the mystery of communication, the mystery of language. When he said the word "yesterday," he had hundreds of ideas about the mystery of time and eternity. And by that time, he'd forgotten what he was going to say and didn't finish the sentence. This would happen to all of us all the time if we were in this state of mystical insight. We would not even be able to complete a sentence. In England, before the war, we had carts pulled by horses that delivered coal. And the horses always wore blinkers over their eyes, so that they were unable to see the traffic around them, and they did not become afraid of the traffic. Their vision was deliberately narrowed like that. Human beings also wear blinkers, so that we are not too bewildered by the world around us. And yet, as soon as we begin to experience these states of excitement, we suddenly recognize that everything is connected together, and that we can only remain sane by breaking things up into small pieces. In America, a doctor named Light has invented a machine which you can place on your head and which shoots electrical impulses into the skull and releases the brain's natural opiates, which are called endorphins. And this produces something like Ouspensky's mystical states. And this is described by a man called Michael Hutchison in a book called Megabrain. Hutchison says that he was sitting at a table talking to Light. He was wearing this sort of skull cap on his head, but it was not switched on. And he began talking to Light about some article he'd just written about biology. And as he began to talk, he got more and more interested and excited because he saw all the implications of everything he'd written, and he began talking at a tremendous speed, so that other people in the room began to look around suspiciously at him, wondering if he was drunk. And then suddenly he noticed that Light had switched on the machine, and that the reason he was so excited was that it had released the endorphins, and suddenly he saw everything implies something else. The American philosopher William James wrote a short essay called A Suggestion About Mysticism, in which he said that he had had 3 experiences which he would describe as mystical experiences. But he said on each occasion they happened so quickly that they disappeared almost instantaneously. But, he says, in each of these experiences the same thing happened. And that is, something that someone said reminded him of something else. And that 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 reminded him of something else. Until he said, like a flash of lightning, zigzagging out to distant horizons, he appeared to see enormous vistas of reality. But not of mystical reality, just ordinary, everyday fact. He talks about distant horizons of fact. In other words, the blinkers had been momentarily removed. And this is what happens in all mystical experience. You become a kind of a bird up in the air, seeing that everything is connected together. Just as when you are in an aeroplane, you see that all the land below you is connected together. Now, Ouspensky went on to describe the strange complexity of the mystical experience. One of the strangest things that Ouspensky says is this, that the subjective becomes the objective, and the objective becomes the subjective. You somehow become as objective as these seats, and yet in another sense, these seats suddenly become you. I don't even pretend to understand what he meant. But he said that in the mystical state, it was absolutely self-evident. He also said that the first thing that happened in these mystical states was that he seemed to pass upwards into a new state of consciousness, which he says was like a realm of mathematics. Again, I don't even begin to understand what he meant. And then he says, at the height of the mystical experience, he seemed to see the whole universe as an enormous rose or a gigantic lotus flower turning itself inside out. And he realized that this is the basic truth about human reality, and that if we could grasp this, we would know the ultimate reality of the universe. Now, one more very interesting thing. Ouspensky said that when he descended from these mystical experiences back into ordinary consciousness, it was horrible. He said, suddenly I felt myself to be in a kind of wooden world, a world with slow, grinding wooden wheels, wooden thoughts, wooden feelings, a wooden body. Everything seemed unutterably heavy after the states of intensity. And he said that he hated this feeling. Now, that, I am convinced, was because Ouspensky was a typical romantic philosopher. He was always looking for ecstasy. I must confess that when I occasionally experience ecstasy, these sudden moods of connectivity, of insight, they begin to bore me after a time. I want to return to ordinary, everyday reality. Because it is when I'm in contact with everyday reality that I can do my work. In the mystical state, I see more, but I'm like someone in an aeroplane. I've lost contact with the earth. So it struck me as a very interesting question. Rudolf Steiner once said, never complain about your lot in life because you chose it before you were born. Well, think of it. If each of you chose your lot in life, including being here at this moment, why did you choose it? If we are living in a wooden world, why did we choose to live in a wooden world rather than in a state of mystical ecstasy all the time? The answer is, human beings are bored by heaven. We don't want heaven. What we want to do is to bring heaven down to earth. And how do we do this? Through media. This is our way of doing it. Through language, through the extensions of man. Through computers, and so on. Through virtual reality, which you will hear Timothy Leary talk about tomorrow. These are our ways of doing it. I want to talk to you about what seems to me the most important idea I've ever had. 5 years ago, I was in California lecturing at a place called Esalen. And as I was being driven back afterwards to San Francisco, I began, simply for the fun of it, to think, how many levels of consciousness can I distinguish? Sounds a very boring idea, but I did it just for the sake of thinking about it. I thought, well, let's see. When I'm deeply asleep, I'm unconscious. I have no consciousness. Okay, so let's call that level 0, level 0. So level 1 is obviously dreams, when I begin to be more or less conscious, but not conscious of myself. Level 1 is dream consciousness. So what is level 2? Level 2 is obviously when you are awake but feeling very dull and heavy. Level 2 is non-reflective consciousness. Think of a child who has been to a party and is now very tired, and he's being carried home by his father. He's awake, and yet he merely sees people passing, and he does not even register where he is. His consciousness is merely like a mirror reflecting his environment. He has no consciousness of himself, merely of the external world. That is level 2. So what is level 3? Level 3 is obviously when suddenly you become conscious of yourself too. Suppose you wake up in the morning with a very bad hangover, and to begin with, you wonder, where am I? That is level 2. That is non-reflective consciousness. And then as you begin to return, and you recognize your environment, and you are there in your bedroom, that is level 3. Self-reflective consciousness, seeing your face in the mirror. But level 3 is still very dull and heavy. You feel as if life is an enormous effort. Emily Bronte wrote a poem which began, "Does the road wind uphill all the way, right to the very end?" And this is the feeling that you get in level 3, that life is one long, enormous burden. So, what is level 4? Level 4 is our ordinary, everyday consciousness, which you and I are now experiencing. In level 4, you are wide awake, you are fairly cheerful, you may be a little bored, but nevertheless, you are coping with your environment. And at the lower end of level 4, life is still very dull and very difficult. But about halfway up level 4, quite suddenly, you begin to get that strange feeling of happiness, that you're winning, that obstacles are beginning to disappear. And in the upper half of our ordinary everyday consciousness, we have that strange feeling that we can win, that life is not preordained to be defeat. Now, the upper end of level 4 is very interesting because the American psychologist Abraham Maslow studied extremely healthy, happy people, and he discovered that all very happy people tend to have what he called peak experiences. Those experiences of sudden, bubbling, overwhelming joy when the whole universe seems marvelous. He said that a young mother was watching her husband and children eat breakfast when a beam of sunlight came in through the window, and she suddenly thought, my God, aren't I lucky? And went into the peak experience. A young man who was working his way through college as a jazz drummer found suddenly at 2 o'clock in the morning as he was drumming away that he was drumming absolutely perfectly. He couldn't do a thing wrong, and he went into the peak experience. All healthy people have the peak experience. And the peak experience is the upper end of level 4, our ordinary human consciousness. And you suddenly bubble over into a higher level of consciousness. You could say that the peak experience is like a spark gap in a spark plug. It's a leap to a higher level. And what is that higher level? The higher level, level 5, is what I call spring morning consciousness. It's that strange feeling that you get when you wake up on a spring day or when you are setting out on holiday. I also call it holiday consciousness, in which your mind seems to be seething and bubbling away. You begin to see the connections between things. You begin to see the implications of everything. You enjoy thinking. Spring morning consciousness is level 5. And I thought, is that as high as we can go? Or no, because spring morning consciousness does not last for very long. If we are lucky, it may last for, say, half an hour. But there are moods of consciousness that continue for a long time. J.B. Priestley, the English playwright, called them magic or delight. Imagine a young couple on honeymoon, staying in a hotel overlooking a beautiful lake with mountains in the distance. Imagine down below in the hotel an orchestra plays a waltz, and suddenly they think life is good, and they feel ecstatically happy. They feel that God has been good to them, and that this feeling will not go away. They will remember this all their lives. And what is more, they stay in that condition, not just for half an hour, but perhaps for days at a time. That is level 6, magic consciousness. Now, I found myself thinking, so is there anything above that? And then I saw, yes, there is. There is a level of consciousness which I called Faculty X. Faculty X happens in a flash, and you suddenly become aware of other times and other places. Do you remember Proust's novel Remembrance of Things Past by the French writer Marcel Proust? At the beginning of the novel, Marcel describes how when he came home one day feeling very tired, his mother gave him a kind of little cake called a madeleine, dipped in herb tea. And he says, as he tasted the cake, a sudden feeling of exquisite pleasure invaded his senses. He said, suddenly, I had ceased to feel mediocre, accidental, mortal. And puzzled by this experience, he tasted the cake again to try to understand what was happening. And the second time he tasted it, he remembered. When he was a little boy, living in a French village called Cambrai, his Aunt Léonie used to give him a taste of her madeleine dipped in the same herb tea. And the taste of the madeleine had suddenly brought back in a flash the whole of his childhood in Cambrai, as if time had ceased to exist. That is level 7, Faculty X. Again, here in Japan, you are very familiar with the works of the historian Arnold Toynbee. As you know, Toynbee wrote a 10-volume study of history. And in the 10th volume, he describes the experiences which led him to studying history. And the most important of these experiences was this. Toynbee says that he'd spent the whole day climbing Mount Taygetus in Greece to go to the ruined citadel of Mistra. The citadel had been destroyed by the Turks at the beginning of the 19th century, in that war that the poet Lord Byron fought in. Toynbee said he sat there on a ruined wall, looking down over the plain of Sparta and eating a bar of chocolate, when quite suddenly, looking at the break in the wall, where 200 years before the Turks had smashed through the wall, poured into Mistra, and killed everyone in the town, it was suddenly as if he could see the Turks now, at this moment. The 2 centuries disappeared. Suddenly it was real, here, in the present moment. And he goes on to describe 10 experiences in which the same kind of thing happened to him, when standing in some spot where a great historical event had occurred, time disappeared, and it was totally real. Now, you could say that was mere imagination, but it was more than imagination. It was imagination amplified to a far higher degree. He also says that one day, when he was walking past Euston Station in London, he suddenly experienced all history at once. Everything which has ever happened, all at once. He said it was a very strange experience to walk past the wall of the station and to be fully aware of his circumstances, the pavement under his feet, the wall on his left-hand side, and at the same moment to experience all history as a kind of flowing stream, and to see his own life as a very small wave in that stream. And this was the experience which led him to write a study of history. That is faculty X, and it is the 7th level of consciousness. Now, the 8th level of consciousness is what we've just been talking about, Ouspensky, mystical consciousness, in which the inside becomes the outside and the outside becomes the inside, the subjective world becomes the objective and the objective becomes the subjective. In short, it is something we human beings cannot understand in our ordinary consciousness. And so, for all practical purposes, we have 7 levels of consciousness. The mystical does not concern us, and yet we know that it is there, and that our ordinary everyday consciousness is merely a limited kind of consciousness, like horses wearing blinkers, and that there is no reason whatever why we should not experience higher levels as soon as we know that they exist. When you are bored and tired, you know that other places exist, and yet you don't believe it. The English writer G.K. Chesterton once said, "We say thank you when someone passes us the salt at table, but we don't mean it. We say the earth is round, but we don't mean it." And yet an astronaut in space can look down on the earth and say the earth is round and mean it. This is what media are for, to extend our natural limitations, to turn us into something more. Now, it seems to me very obvious that man is now on the point of a major change, a major evolutionary change to a new level, and that it is happening now at this point in history. If you ask me, what will man be like in 1 century from now, I answer that thousands of human beings will experience every day these higher states of consciousness, which means that human beings will no longer be so easily defeated. It will be almost as if human beings were permanently drunk, and yet simply drunk with vitality. That question asked by the Romantics, is the world misery or is the world ecstasy, will be answered in favor of ecstasy, intensity. Now, there's one more fascinating thing about all this, which is very relevant here in Japan. In the West, we have lost a sense of the real meaning of time, because we're always in a hurry. And the result is that we discount time. In Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, the Queen explains that Father Time is no longer on speaking terms with her, because when she was playing music, someone shouted, "She is murdering time," which simply means she was playing badly. And ever since then, Father Time has not been speaking to her. Well, in the West, we also tend to murder time. When I came to Japan in 1986, I was taken to the famous rock garden in the temple at Kyoto. And as I sat looking at the rock garden, I suddenly understood that here in Japan you still understand what time is. That time is when you descend from ordinary consciousness with its concerns into a deeper level of meaning, where time no longer matters. 2 days ago, at the beginning of this conference, I went along to the house of the architect Kurakawa. He lives in a very beautiful flat, but outside in the garden, he's built a tea room, exactly as it was 400 years ago. And as we sat there, watching the tea ceremony, once again, I experienced the same feeling that I'd experienced in the rock garden. Time, in our ordinary Western sense, ceases to be important. Instead, we relax into a deeper level at which we suddenly become aware of ourselves, of our real selves, and of the real world instead of the phenomenal world. Now, in the West, we tend to experience this only through crisis, through difficulty. I always tell the same story in my lectures to illustrate this point about the English novelist Graham Greene, who describes how when he was a child, he sank into a state of utter misery and depression. And the chief characteristic of this state of misery was that he would see that something was beautiful visually with his eyes, but he would feel nothing whatever. He felt dead inside. While he was in this state of depression, he found in a cupboard a revolver belonging to his elder brother. And he took it out into the fields and played Russian roulette. That is, he inserted one single bullet in the chambers, he spun the chambers, he pointed the gun at his head, and he pulled the trigger. And when there was just a click, he looked down the barrel and saw that the bullet had now come into position. So he had missed death by only one chamber. And he said as this happened, he experienced an overwhelming feeling of sheer joy, the feeling that the world is an incredibly beautiful and complex place. And yet, the next morning, it had gone. He played Russian roulette 6 times. And at the end of the 6th time, he was bored with it. So this is our problem in the West. You see that when he pulled the trigger, he did instantaneously what you can do here in Japan with the tea ceremony, or by contemplating a rock garden. Suddenly, he became real, and time became real. And yet, after 6 times, it ceased to be real, and he could no longer re-establish contact with it. And he spent the rest of his life writing awful, miserable novels about people who often commit suicide. I find him one of the most detestable writers of the 20th century. I'm glad he's dead. This tends to be the way that in the West we establish contact with time through crisis. Crisis wakes us up. We've lost this ability to discover real time by sinking deep inside ourselves. The psychologist Wilhelm Reich devised a very interesting Western method for achieving these states of deep meditation, which, as I say, is very difficult for a Westerner. He made his students lie down on the floor, then he made them breathe in very deeply, as if they were breathing some kind of golden vitality from the air, some life force. And then he made them breathe out very slowly, saying as they did so, out, down, through. Out through the lungs, down through the solar plexus, through the genitals, and down through the feet. And you will find that if you lie on the floor and take very deep breaths, hold the breath for a moment, and then say, out, down, through, envisaging as you do so that you are pushing a vital energy down through your body begins to glow with a strange energy, as if thousands of little points of light have lit up all over your flesh. I see Tim recognizes what I'm talking about. Now, I often use this technique to teach people to go into deep meditation, but I discovered an equally interesting technique. Think of what happened when Graham Greene pointed the gun at his head and pulled the trigger. He was in a condition of boredom, the wrong kind of relaxation, unable to summon any vitality. Now, he pointed the gun at his head, he pulled the trigger, and as he pulled the trigger, his whole being would go, ah! Then there was just click, and he goes, whew. And so, the basic principle is, ah! Followed by, whew. The English writer Thomas de Quincey once asked the poet Wordsworth, how do you have these strange mystical states in which you see the whole universe as beautiful? Wordsworth said, I don't know, I can't explain. But that afternoon, they went to meet a cart which was bringing the mail from a distant town. And Wordsworth lay down and put his ear against the ground to listen for the rumbling noise made by the cart. And as he straightened up, he saw the first star of the evening in the sky. And he said to De Quincey, now I can tell you how I do it. Whenever my mind is completely concentrated on something that has nothing whatever to do with poetry, and then suddenly I relax, whatever I see as I relax appears extremely beautiful. In other words, same thing. Now, I realize that if that is the principle, then when my mind is very tired, I should be able to induce energy by doing that. And I discovered how to do it. You can all do it. It's very simple. Try doing it this way. Just take a pen and hold it up so that you can see a blank wall or a ceiling. And then concentrate on the pen. Concentrate. Give it everything you've got until you see nothing but the pen. Then relax so that you see the wall behind the pen. And then once again, concentrate. Then relax. And then concentrate. And then relax. You will find that when you've done it about 10 times, it begins to hurt. When it begins to hurt, keep going, because you are almost there. Push yourself further and you break through into the peak experience. Now, one day in Finland, I was teaching a group of students the pen trick. Concentrate, relax, concentrate, relax. I'd also been telling them about Reichian breathing, about out, down, through. And then I said, look, let's try combining the two exercises, which sounds difficult because obviously one depends on total relaxation, whereas the other depends upon total concentration. But we tried it. You take in a deep breath, and as you breathe in, you concentrate. And then you relax with out, down, through. And again, you breathe in and you concentrate. And then once again, out, down, through. And I found that as I was doing this, lying flat on the floor, a strange feeling of ecstasy began to trickle through my body. It made no difference even that my arm began to ache, holding the pen in the air. there was such a strange feeling of total happiness that I didn't want to stop doing it. And after we'd been lying there in this curious, still state for a long time, I suddenly looked at my watch and said, "My God, lunch started half an hour ago." And we all leapt to our feet and went in to eat. But we had totally forgotten time. Time had disappeared. It had stopped. But you can see what a complicated way we have of doing these things in the West. This, of course, is because we do not have a real religious tradition. Our religious tradition, Christianity, also once had a mystical tradition. But then Christianity began to break up and disappear about 3 centuries ago with Isaac Newton. By the 18th century, nobody believed in it very deeply. And so the whole mystical tradition also evaporated. Now, this has not happened here in Japan. And this is something that I find very fascinating. I was speaking the other day to a journalist called Murray Sale, who began talking to me about the Japanese economic miracle. And he said, of course, the reason the Japanese make so much money is that they keep reinvesting it. In the West, when we have a lot of money, we tend to use it in conspicuous consumption. We buy big houses and so on. We buy expensive objects. But here in Japan, they have still this strong religious tradition, which in the West we tend to call the Protestant ethic, meaning that some people feel guilty about simply relaxing and spending lots of money. He said the result of this is that they are extraordinary workers, and yet they work in a religious spirit. Their work has become a kind of religion. He said, don't believe anyone who tells you that the Japanese are merely commercial. They're successful not because they're commercial, but because they're religious. And suddenly he made all these things come together for me. Suddenly I saw that this notion of real time is what we are talking about. The ordinary physical world surrounds us all the time. The result is that we are like blinkered horses, or a better analogy would be a bullfighter using his cape in front of the bull, so the bull can never actually see more than a few yards. No matter how the bull twists and turns, the bullfighter keeps the cape in front of its nose. And in the same way, the ordinary everyday world keeps its cape in front of our noses. And very occasionally we brush aside the cape for a moment and see beyond it. And then the cape comes back again, and we are once again trapped in the present moment. In the West, we've become accustomed to being trapped in the present moment. And so we attempt to avoid boredom by excessive consumption, by so-called pleasure, enjoyment. The kind of pleasure which I must confess would drive me to suicide. I hate being happy. It bores me. What I want to do is to work. And that is why I suddenly realized that my temperament exists in only one country in the world, in Japan. And that if these new men are to emerge, it will be in Japan where they emerge first. When I speak about an evolutionary leap to a higher stage, I believe that it can happen more easily in Japan than anywhere else in the world, because all the basic machinery for this leap already exists here. The problem is a very simple one. At the present moment, man has overwhelmed himself with his means of information. My house is full of books. I have 30,000 books in it. I also have 30,000 gramophone records. And the result is, I can never read all the books or play all the gramophone records. And now I'm 60 years old, I realize that I shall never play all my gramophone records. Sheer information has overwhelmed me. And yet, nevertheless, I continue to listen to music and to enjoy it. When I experience these sudden curious moods of strength, I suddenly know perfectly well what I want to read and what I want to listen to. Now, this, in a sense, is one of the most difficult things for us to grasp. Let me put it in the form of a story. There was, in England, a commercial traveller called Smith, who was travelling one day across the Scottish moors, which are enormous and bleak. And he was very anxious to reach his destination, a hotel for the night. And he was extremely bored with the long drive to the hotel. But halfway across the moor, his car broke down. Something went wrong with the engine, and he felt this was a boring inconvenience, and stopped and looked inside the engine, decided there was nothing he could do, and he would simply have to walk back along the road to the nearest telephone and summon help. Still, he was in a bored state. But as he began to walk back along the road, it began to snow. And soon he could no longer see the road under his feet. And when he began to stagger, he realized that he was now walking on the moor and that he'd lost his way. And now suddenly he realized with horror that he was in a very dangerous situation, that he might die before the night was over. And now he began to panic. And then, just as it was becoming dark, he saw in the distance a building. He thought, thank God, I found a farm. And he stumbled towards it, and when he reached it, realized that it was merely an empty barn, a wooden shack, and there was nothing in it whatsoever. But when he went inside, he found at least there was something inside it. There was straw for cattle. And he found that if he went into one corner of the barn, he could escape from the wind and wrap himself in the straw and stay warm. And he did this. And then he sat there, listening to the wind blowing outside and to the snow pattering on the roof. And suddenly he felt ecstatically happy. He felt that he could have sat there forever, merely listening to the wind and listening to the snow on the roof. He had moved from one state of consciousness into another. He had moved into real time. Now, this is something that we can do quite easily when we are confronted by crisis. But I want to draw your attention to something. Again, let me tell you a story. Imagine that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are sitting on either side of the fire in their room in Baker Street on a foggy, rainy November morning. Watson has read the Times from beginning to end, and finally, yawning, hardly able to speak because he's rather bored, he says, "I see Lord Mancroft is dead, Holmes. Did you ever happen to meet him?" And Holmes replies, "As a matter of fact, Watson, that was the beginning of one of the most bizarre cases of my whole career. Would you like to hear about it?" And instantly, Watson is wide awake. Now, you would say Holmes did it, because Holmes said, "Would you like to hear my story?" But is that true? No. The moment Holmes said, "As a matter of fact, Watson," it was as if Watson had pushed a button inside his chest to wake himself up. Watson did it himself. We can all do this. We can wake ourselves from this state of sleep into a state of intensity by an act of will. And this for me is the most interesting thing of all. You see, I'm now 60 years old, and all my life I've been looking for this method of inducing intensity by willpower, believing that it can be done when we want to. The poets of the 19th century did not believe that you can do it when you want to. They thought that inspiration came when it wanted to, and it went when it wanted to, and there was nothing you could do about it. I have never believed this. I believe it must be possible for us to induce the states of ecstasy and intensity at will. And little by little, I began to see how this can be done. And yet, I still find myself subject to those same states of up and down that the romantics of the 19th century experienced. So that when I feel down, I wonder whether this is not all an illusion. Now, little by little, over the past 6 months, I've begun to discover that I can do it at will, that I can induce the peak experience by sheer concentration and make it stay. And now I see it. I see that this is also logical. If we have 7 levels of consciousness, you can see that the 4th level, our ordinary everyday consciousness, is extremely significant. Level 1 is dreams. Level 2 is mirror consciousness. Level 3 is ego awareness consciousness. As we go into level 4, which is ordinary consciousness, it is still heavy and dull. But halfway up level 4, at level 3.5, we begin to experience the feeling that we can win. All human beings have to do is to recognize this and to deliberately make the effort to stay in the upper half of level 4. 3.5 is exactly a half of 7. This is why the human race is on the point of a breakthrough to a higher stage. When Maslow discovered that everyone can have peak experiences, he had made an enormous evolutionary discovery. And this is the most significant thing about Maslow's discovery. Maslow found that when he began to talk to his students about peak experiences, they began to remember peak experiences they'd had in the past but had now forgotten, until they were suddenly reminded of it, like the boy working his way through college as a jazz drummer. And as soon as they began to talk to one another about peak experiences, they began having peak experiences all the time. I once asked Maslow, how can we have peak experiences at will? And Maslow replied, it is impossible. You can't will it. And yet Maslow himself had discovered the secret. You may not be able to will it, but as soon as you begin to think about the peak experience, to understand it, to see its implications, you begin to have peak experiences. Just one more point, because I'm going to stop in exactly 1 minute. The English biologist Rupert Sheldrake has made an extremely interesting discovery. He claims that it started by reading this story about the monkeys on Kojima Island off the coast of Japan. You remember the story, don't you? That the monkeys on Kojima Island were given potatoes to eat, and they learned to wash their potatoes in the sea. First, one intelligent monkey learned how to do it, and then all the monkeys on Kojima Island began to wash their potatoes in the sea because they liked the taste of salt on the potatoes. And then monkeys on other islands, which had no connection with Kojima Island, began doing the same thing. A kind of telepathy, you'd say. But no, it cannot be telepathy, because the same principle operates with crystals. Some crystals, which are being newly made for industrial processes, are extremely difficult to crystallize in the laboratory. But once one crystal has been crystallized anywhere in the world, they begin to crystallize everywhere more easily. At first, they thought that perhaps this was because scientists were carrying fragments of crystal in their beards or in their clothes when they went to other laboratories. And then they discovered this was not true. In some strange way, the crystals also can learn from one another by a process which is like electrical induction. And you see what this means? It means that if you, here, sitting in this hall, could begin to discover the secret of the peak experience and of remaining in the upper half of level 4, there would be enough of us here to transmit it to the whole human race. Everything would change. Everything would change because suddenly we would realize that we are in charge. We are in charge of the media, of all of these media we're speaking of, from language to virtual reality. And as soon as this recognition hits you, everything changes. You are suddenly in a new position. It's almost as if you'd spent your life upside down, and suddenly you're the right way up for the first time. It could begin now, at this moment. And as soon as it begins, it will continue throughout the human race. And I believe that the place where it could begin is here in Japan. Now, shut up.
これをもちまして、コリン・ウィルソンさんによります特別講演を終わらせていただきます。ご使用になりました同時通訳レシーバーは、お座席に置いたままご退席くださいますようご協力お願い申し上げます。明日のここ県民会館大ホールでは、午前9時30分より梅原武さん、10時45分よりティモシー・リアリーさんの特別講演が行われます。ぜひご参加くださいますようお願い申し上げます。本日は誠にありがとうございました。ここでお客様にお呼び出しを申し上げます。株式会社中電工島根支店の高橋光様。株式会社中電工島根支店の高橋光様。いらっしゃいましたら、大ホール入り口までお越しくださいますようご案内申し上げます。